Whatever it is that you thought about No Man's Sky 5 years ago, you were probably wrong. And honestly, that's probably not your fault either. In today's video, I want to take a brief retrospective of the last 5 years of No Man's Sky's life, catch you up on this insanely brilliant story that is this studio and this game, for those of you who are likely just getting ready to jump in, and talk about the overall state of No Man's Sky in the year 2021 and beyond. So, let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the LZ, and hello if you're new here. Would love to hear from you in the comment section below either way on your thoughts on the last 5 years of No Man's Sky, whether you've played the game or not. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about 4 topics that I think are important to sort of reflect on as we are getting ready to talk more about No Man's Sky this year and in the coming weeks. I also appreciate a like and a share from everybody if you thought this video was informational. But 4 topics today that I want to talk about is, first, Sean Murray didn't turn out to be the devil that everyone kind of thought that he might have been 5 years ago. We'll touch on the impossible ambition that this game was, and still is. We'll speak on how No Man's Sky is absolutely embarrassing larger AAA games in the games as a service space. And of course, the road ahead for this game in the near future and far. So to start, I have some thoughts about kind of where we were 5 years ago when the infamous launch of No Man's Sky happened, and this is really the biggest point as to why I think we were all wrong about this game 5 years ago. You see, back in those days, games launched regularly in terrible states. The gaming industry was largely sort of jaded by how larger publishers treat them as consumers, whether it be the larger publishers like Ubisoft or Electronic Arts or Activision. Folks like you and me in this industry were really sort of trained to object to this kind of botched launch, and we all agree that No Man's Sky, for better or worse, was a botched launch. But what many of us don't know is sort of the reasons why. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, LZ, there is no reason to launch a game like this. And I want you to put a pin in that for a second while I explain. And I've talked about this on the channel before, but I don't think that Sean Murray was ever the devil that people sort of made him out to be in the sort of reactionary internet and YouTube space. When I think of somebody like Sean Murray, I think it's important to know his sort of history and what led up to that launch. Sean Murray worked for Electronic Arts in a AAA studio, regularly churning out games like Burnout, and the guy is a coding genius. But Sean Murray made the decision to leave the AAA gaming space with a few of his friends to start the studio that would become Hello Games. The man even went so far as to sell his own home to make this dream happen. Let him remind you that Sean Murray is also married and has children. So that's a huge decision that I'm not sure my own wife would even allow me to make. It will not, especially for that kind of risk, but, you know, I'm not a coding genius like Sean Murray is either. At around that time, they began to crank out games like Joe Danger, which, you know, met a moderately decent success, to be honest, which helped to fuel the further drive of the studio. From then, they became 4 members, and increased their size sort of exponentially as the years went on. Sean Murray and 3 of his buddies decided to sort of break off from the rest of the team and begin to work on what is probably some impossible ambition. A lot like the studio Mojang, if you remember Mojang, probably all of you do, considering Microsoft just bought them years ago for like $8 billion. They're responsible for the mega universal hit that it was Minecraft. And I think that this is sort of where Sean Murray was going with this idea of creating this sort of space game. When the game was revealed, it's undoubted that most of us were intrigued. No Man's Sky's small but surprising reveal sort of shocked us all and left us in wonder as to what kind of game this is. What do you do in No Man's Sky, which was the gigantic question. that we sort of all asked and all kind of entertained. It inevitably went on to be a question that nobody could rightfully answer because there was no right or wrong answer to said question. Shortly after, the Hello Games studios in Guildford sort of flooded and became destroyed. I remember seeing pictures and news stories hit shortly after the reveal of No Man's Sky about how they basically had to start their studio over. And those of us who were really curious and intrigued by No Man's Sky were genuinely worried that the studio was finished based on some arbitrary act of God that they have no control over. At that point, kind of funny to me is I remember bigwigs like Phil Spencer and the heads of studios like Sony, or publishers like Sony, were reaching out, asking Sean Murray if he needed any kind of help. Just let us know, Sean. We would be happy to take you under our wing to assist your studio on getting back off the ground. Even the publishers knew what No Man's Sky was. Put a pin on that. We're going to come back to that here in a moment. Now, I think one thing that we can all agree on that No Man's Sky probably was revealed a little bit too early, because another couple of years, at least 2 or 3 years, went by before we would eventually see the game. Yours truly received a review code out of nowhere straight from Sony for probably likely my endless coverage over the years leading up to launch. But through those years, Hello Games went through quite a strenuous time. My kitchen and dining room were larger than this studio's workspace for, a dozen people. And traveling on indie funds where they had worked out a PlayStation exclusive sort of launch at least that time. But let's be clear, Sony was not publishing the game, but only pushing the physical version for No Man's Sky. None of us really know what those deal and details were of that type of deal, but we know that it happened, and that largely for the better part of 2 years, PlayStation and PC were the place to play No Man's Sky. I remember closer to launch, we were about a month away from launch. The game was actually supposed to launch in July of 2016. And probably one of the darkest times, I would say, a fan and a content creator of No Man's Sky would have gone through was then. You see, it wasn't even Sean Murray and Hello Games that unveiled that the game would be delayed by a month and some change, but rather it was leaked by a journalist from then, Kotaku, who is now working for Bloomberg, which ignited a firestorm of harassment and death threats and things like that towards the studio that I think we'd all really rather forget, right? I look back on what I said a moment ago that Sean Murray didn't actually end up being the devil that we all thought that he was, or was convinced or told that we should believe, because the very fact that he left the AAA industry to do something new without leaning on AAA publishers. The man sold his home to start a dream and an impossible ambition. His studio was destroyed, and he basically had to rebuild it to a degree. And remember when I said to put a pin in those publishers who were reaching out asking Sean Murray for help? Those same publishers, like Sony Interactive Studios, when Sean Murray really needed them, when he really needed extra time to delay his game to make it in a better state so that they didn't face those problems, those publishers and those platform holders were nowhere to be seen to help that studio continue. They even had to crunch to try to make the finish line because, and the biggest point of why I don't think the studio was the devil that everybody presented them as being, Hello Games almost bankrupt. They almost ran out of money. This was quoted directly from Sean Murray. So, for a moment, for those of you who are like, it doesn't matter why the game launched the way that it is, it should not have happened, consider for a moment, just think and put yourself in Sean Murray's shoes, right? Would you have rather risked your studio closing and No Man's Sky having never launched, or would you have simply put it out the gate and just let the fire burn and deal with it afterwards? Because after all, you've put 4 to 5 years of development into this game, pulled a bunch of other developers and staff members with you along this journey, only to see it break down at the end. I'm not sure about you, but I would have likely did the same thing he did. And I'm kind of glad he did. Obviously, I don't want to downplay the troubles that they had and the harassment that they faced when the game was delayed, but delays happen all the time. Sometimes it doesn't matter, but others, it's for the best. Now, you're probably asking, LZ, why are you relitigating the last 5 years, including the terrible launch period that the game had? Well, my answer would be that I think it's important to realize that Hello Games and No Man's Sky are not and should not be compared to other larger studios. A couple of months ago, I put out a video stating that we should stop comparing games like Cyberpunk to No Man's Sky because they are absolutely not the same thing. The video went on to, talk about how a studio like CD Projekt Red absolutely has the money, the bandwidth, and the time to not crunch and delay their game indefinitely, or pretty much indefinitely, until it's finished and correct. The studio knew that it was in a bad shape. They had the capacity to delay it and launch it in a better state. Hello Games didn't. CD Projekt Red did what they did. Hello Games did what they had to. And so the next time you see a game that comes out and launches in a terrible state from a large publisher, we should really stop thinking about No Man's Sky and thinking about that publisher as in the same camp for bad things that happen and how you were somehow wronged as a consumer. Cyberpunk just went back on digital stores with a giant red asterisk. I would remind you that it's still not in the best shape that it could be. Especially for last-gen consoles that it's running on. But then look at games like Anthem. Anthem was supposed to be the next Destiny. It was supposed to be the next games as a service that was going to be revolutionary. When that game launched, many of us did the same thing. We said, oh, it's the next No Man's Sky. And honestly, we were wrong about that too, because here's why. Just like the Cyberpunk scenario, I think about Anthem. I think about Electronic Arts and BioWare, a team and a publisher and a gigantic stockpile of money that could have easily delayed that game until it was done. They chose not to. Hello Games had no choice. When we look back on those comparisons, you can look at Anthem. Anthem is dead and buried. To be fair to Anthem, they went back and started to do something what they thought kind of a No Man's Sky behavior was, which is to sort of put your head down and keep working and, try to release a sort of Anthem 2.0 that was going to come out and be revolutionary and hugely different. And EA took it out to pasture because either they couldn't afford it or didn't wish to have it be a further investment. Here it is, 5 years later, Hello Games are still trucking along. A fraction of the size of many of those studios. A fraction of the riches that those studios have. And when I say games as a service is done right, over those 5 years, Hello Games have released over 16 titled updates, never once asking you for another penny. Not even so much as for merch for the game or the studio. I think either earlier this year or later last year, they finally put up a merch store after fans of the game and the studio begged them to put up merch. We, as a community, were making our own merch and selling our own stuff, and Hello Games didn't care. And so 3 to 4 times a year, the studio is pumping out a constant evolution of updates free of charge and is on sale like every other month on all platforms. And even more so now, even better is not only are these updates regular, free, consistent, well, mostly consistent. I'm looking at you, Beyond. You're still an awful update. Hello Games is following the community's lead on the types of features that they're adding to these games in subsequent updates that are, again, free of charge. So with all of that in the rearview mirror, and an endlessly escalating popularity on Steam at least for just how well this game is doing or how far it's come, what about the road ahead for this game in the studio? Well, at the moment of publishing this video, we still have another massive anniversary update on the way. Generally, it's these anniversary updates that are most popular, most feature-rich, and most evolving to the game's experience. So any day or any current upcoming week, we could see the drop of another update that is going to churn headlines just like they have in every single year leading up to this point. No Man's Sky isn't the game that it was 5 years ago. It's better off for it. A lot of my viewers and online friends kind of preferred a lot of what No Man's Sky was, sort of in its first couple of years, but almost nobody that I know is complaining about what it went on to become. So while we're all here on the internet, on YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, whatever, complaining about how some publisher or video game has offended your consumer rights, or how we're perpetuating some attitude about how the little guy developer is the same as a large-scale billion-dollar publisher, let's continue to remember what happened with No Man's Sky and how it truly became the greatest redemption arc for any video game probably of all time. So in the future, when you see a game that launches in a poor state when it absolutely didn't need to, instead of saying, well, that's the next No Man's Sky, maybe we can turn that behavior and that criticism around and say that maybe that game can become the next No Man's Sky instead. Once again, thank you again for joining the LZ, and I'm so happy to have you here. Again, comment down below what you thought of the last 5 years of No Man's Sky. Are you jumping into No Man's Sky for the first time based on updates or what your friends in your orbit are saying about this game or how you found it on YouTube? I'd like to hear from you below. Follow me on Twitter at TheLZTweets. And don't forget to help out the channel here by throwing a like on the video. Much appreciated if you thought it was great. See you in the next one.